to the MrpTech Podcast. This is episode 46. My name is Matt. I am your host, and this is the weekly podcast discussing everyday tech for everyday people. Thanks so much for joining me this week, as I have a bunch to talk about in Linux this week. But before we get to that, before we get to the main topic today, what I want to do is I want to talk to you about one of my favorite YouTube channels out there right now. And the YouTube channel is called Answers with Joe. And Joe Scott is someone who has been creating YouTube videos for over a year now. And his videos are super well produced, very professional looking. And he talks a lot about science and scientific research. Just another interest of mine that I usually find myself watching his videos whenever I see a new one that is produced. Just recently, he was sort of experimenting with live streaming on YouTube for the very first time. I didn't know this, but I came across his first live stream on YouTube. And it sort of struck a chord with me because he was talking about a lot of things that hit home with me on all sorts of topics. And the topic that he chose to cover in his first live stream was the topic of fear. And he went on to discuss how he had various technical issues with his first live stream event, and he had to delay it and didn't get things happening exactly how he wanted to. And then he went on to tell a story about when he was younger, being a part of a music program and being forced to do recitals on stage and just being absolutely terrified to be in front of people and performing in front of people. And then he related that to the fear that he has when clicking that live stream button and going live. And I sent Joe a message this week because a lot of the things that he said are the same exact things that I'm going through right now. He mentioned that he was experimenting with live streaming, and if you haven't seen my YouTube channel, I've been experimenting with live streaming over the last few weeks. And it sort of expands what I'm comfortable with to get me out of my comfort zone and trying new things. I really like the audio format of this podcast because I can go back and I can edit things that I don't like out of the podcast. I don't do a whole lot of editing. In fact, I try not to. But one of the things that I do is I really strive for a better quality week after week. And what Joe was going through is he was talking about performance anxiety and fear of public speaking, something that I dealt with for years before getting interested in podcasting. Even as a teacher and even as a professional musician who was often on stage, the general anxiety of having to public speak is something that I think we all probably deal with from time to time. And if you haven't seen his videos, I certainly encourage you to check some of his videos out. I will try to put a link to his first live stream event, talking about facing your fears and leaning into your fears to better yourselves. And I really think that's a great way to put it. You know, one of the reasons I started this podcast was to push the envelope and to try to become a better public speaker, so that I would be a better teacher and so that I would be a better speaker on stage in front of an audience. And this gives me an opportunity to do it week after week. And so I have been testing a live stream on my YouTube channel. And last week on Friday, I did a live stream review of Linux Mint 18. We're going to get into that in just a minute. And what I've found over the last year of podcasting is I really enjoy doing this every week. And as I just told an old teacher of mine recently, I sent him a message telling him how much I enjoy my job of teaching music. I feel like the last 12 years of teaching, I haven't worked a day of my life because I really enjoy doing what I do. And it's sort of the same thing happens when it comes to podcasting. It's something that I really enjoy doing and really enjoy creating on a weekly basis. It gives me an opportunity to be creative, to create new things regularly, and get better at it in the process. Now, if you were to go back and listen to episodes 1 through probably 20 of this podcast, they're not going to sound the greatest, but each week there's improvements that's being made. And I still try to improve weekly and add new things and add new ideas. And I'm finding that the more that I do reviews, the more I create video reviews on YouTube, I'm really set up as far as everything that I need to do except for an HDMI capture card. It would make my life so much more easy to create these videos. Currently, if I'm reviewing a Linux distribution or something, what I'm doing is I'm recording, screen recording the desktop, then uploading it to Dropbox or something similar, and bringing it over to my main workstation where I have to download the file and then edit and then re-upload the final product to YouTube. And that's not really practical when it comes to live streaming events or future ideas for this podcast, where I may in the future want to do a video podcast instead of just audio. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw this out there, and I don't like doing this, but I'm going to throw this out there to see if any of you out there may want to help me complete my setup here. I don't plan on doing this a lot. I realize that some podcasts out there have sponsors. I don't really want to go that route. That just doesn't seem to me like the right path to go. And so what I'm going to ask is if anybody out there wants to help me get an HDMI capture card. I have on my website a donation tab. You can pay with PayPal. And I have realistic intentions here. I am not going to become a YouTube star. I don't expect 20,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel. But I love creating. And if you're enjoying the content here and you have a couple extra bucks to maybe help me out, if you could go to my website, mrptechreviews.com, just hit that donate button and help me get an HDMI capture card. They're really expensive, about $300. And I don't really have the funding to do that. And I'd like to keep growing here on this podcast. And if you don't want to do that, that's fine. I'm going to leave it there at that. I don't want to say any more, but I would appreciate all donations. Here's what I'll do, though, if you do make a donation and help me out. I will do a show segment of your choice. I'll research whatever topic you want me to talk about, and I will put that in the show. And I'll also give you a thank you for helping me out, either on the show or in person, not in person, by email. And maybe even do a live stream episode reviewing the product. What I want to get is the Majuel HDMI capture card, $2.99 on Amazon right now. And so if you really enjoy the content that I provide, and you want to throw me a few bucks to help me get a capture card so that in the future maybe I can do a video podcast or to help me out with the YouTube channel right now, I would appreciate that. And I will definitely turn around and give it right back to you as far as the content that I'm providing here for these podcasts and video reviews. So moving along now, what I want to get into is my review of Linux Mint 18.1. As I mentioned earlier, this past week, I did a live stream event, and I'll put the link in the show notes, my first live stream, and I chose to review Linux Mint 18. The reason I did that was because it had been a long time since I reviewed Linux Mint, and I wanted to see what is new. Now I was using Linux Mint 18.1. It just came out probably late November, and I hadn't had a chance to take a look at it yet. And with Linux Mint 18.1, you're looking at the Cinnamon 3 desktop. I really enjoyed the look and feel and how polished it looked. That's something I've always enjoyed about Linux Mint. They take the extra effort to really make sure that everything looks nice, everything feels nice, and it works well on any type of setup that I ever really need it to. To give you an example of that, a few years ago, I came across a couple extra really old laptops. They were 32-bit laptops, and they weren't being used for anything. And what I decided to do was put the 32-bit versions of Linux Mint on those laptops. And then I was able to actually use those with my students. So students were able to listen to music. They were able to watch tutorial videos on certain software that I wanted them to use as far as what they could use in my music classes, recording. I wanted them to learn Audacity. I wanted them to learn a few other tools. And they were really just bare bones computers. There was nothing to them, no flash to them. But it gave me an option to help my students in ways that I never was able to before. So what I really like about Mint is the flexibility between modern hardware and older hardware. They still have a 32-bit version available in all of their desktop environment releases, whether you're running Cinnamon or KDE or Mate or XFCE. You have the ability to run on some of that older hardware, and including computers that are 10 years old. I believe at the time I was trying the Mate desktop, but as I remember, I came across an even older computer that I put XFCE on, the really lightweight desktop, and it flew. It really did. It really worked well. So I've used Linux Mint in the past for a couple of things, and one of the things that I talked about in the live stream is I had out of all those laptops I just mentioned, I had a newer, let's say, laptop. I had, I think, 2 gigs of RAM in it instead of 512 megabytes. And this one I tried to put Ubuntu on. And Ubuntu it was sort of lagging a little bit. And I put the Cinnamon edition of Mint on it because we were still at the time running Windows XP on our school computers. And I just didn't want to use XP anymore. So I installed Mint on this computer, and I said, I wonder if the SmartBoard software would be available in Linux. And it actually turned out that the SmartBoards that we were using actually had a Linux release. And I downloaded it, installed the software, and I had a fully functional SmartBoard running with Linux. And as students came in, they were curious on why the screen looked different than any other classroom. So I got them engaged, and I would take time to explain, this is free. You can try this yourself. And some students did. Some students got really motivated and wanted to learn more about Linux. And over the last few years, I sort of stepped away from Linux Mint as I went a different direction. Then I started hearing some things about the security concerns about Linux Mint. And that's one thing that sort of got me away from using it for a little while. I never was quite sure what to make of all of the discussion about security in Linux Mint. And I sort of watched from a spectator's standpoint and sort of watched everything pan out. And last February, about a year ago now, the Mint website was hacked and basically contained a backdoor, and hundreds of Linux Mint downloads were compromised because of this. And sort of Linux Mint had the default update settings that would not update the Linux kernel or notify the user when security updates and bug fixes were being published upstream. And it left users vulnerable to things like root exploits, potential hardware issues, and there may have already been patches or security fixes for those already available. But with Linux Mint 18, we're seeing security improvements. They have the ability to update to the latest kernel that's sort of independent of all the other updates, not needing to go to the command line. Everything's done from the updater itself, along with the addition of something like X-Apps. Now, this new project created by the Linux Mint developers basically allows a set of applications to be updated and given new features with incremental improvements made to them that will benefit all of the environments that are used for Linux Mint. So they're using modern toolkits, modern technologies, high DPI support with the traditional user interfaces like title bars and menu bars, and they're made to be able to work everywhere. Aside from what desktop environment you're using or what Linux distribution you're using, these X apps are made to work and give you more functionality than the traditional GTK apps. At the same time, with using X apps, Linux Mint gives you the option to use the older apps as well if it's something that you like to use. These apps are available in the software repositories. You can just download them as you would normally. So things like Xed is based on Pluma and acts as a default text editor. You have Xviewer that replaced Eye of Gnome. Xreader is based on Atril that acts as the default PDF reader. You have Xplayer now that's taking over what Totem used to do. Pix will replace Gthumb. And you can install these apps side by side and compare them and see which one you like best. That's what I find is really nice to see, that you can choose between the X apps and traditional apps. And the update manager itself has received many improvements. It looks great. It looks really polished, and it seems to fly. It really seems to work well. And whatever they did behind the scenes is much improved from the last time that I used Linux Mint, which was probably Linux Mint 17, the first version of Linux Mint 17. You can even now select kernel updates, which I thought was great. And even though they're not really updates, it gives you the availability of packages for newer kernels, which is nice to see. So Linux Mint, especially as I mentioned in the live stream, with that look and polish, comes a new theme package, and it's the Mint Y package. Now, previously the Mint X package would come with a default background that was all white, very bright, and I actually much prefer the darker theme. It's much easier on my eyes when I sit down and I want to do a lot of work on my computer. You can still go back and select the traditional Mint X theme, but I think that all of these default changes are positive, and I think they're a step in the right direction. And it makes me consider Mint again as a viable option to do various tasks from time to time that I would need. I'm not sure I would want to use Linux Mint full-time with everything, but I started off with running Linux Mint for a very specific reason. I wanted to see how it worked in a virtual machine, because on my Mac, what I like to do is I like to have at least one Linux distribution installed in a virtual machine for software use, for an extra layer of security when I want to do certain things like online banking, etc. It just acts as an extra layer. It's still not a 100% isolated environment, but it gives me an extra layer of security that makes me feel a little more comfortable sometimes. So I started off, and so far it seems to be working great in a virtual machine. I hope to leave it installed for a while and just see if it fits everything that I need personally for using Linux in a virtual machine. But what I also did is I also went and I installed it on a 10-year-old laptop and decided to give it a run there. And I have an old Dell Inspiron 1545. It's got 8 gigs of RAM, SSD, hard drive. I think it has a dual-core processor in it. And when I went to install it, there was an error saying that it was missing a piece of software and it wasn't installed, and that if I tried to install it, it may install incorrectly. But I decided to let it go anyway, just for fun, to see what would happen. And it seems to have installed without any issue. And so far, it seems to be working great. By doing so, I blew away my old Ubuntu Studio install. I really enjoyed Ubuntu Studio, but XFCE for me had limitations that I just couldn't get around. And so I was running into some issues with the what I think is a beautiful XFCE installation and great, beautiful themes in Ubuntu Studio. But it was time to move on to new things just for a little while. For now, I may return to Ubuntu Studio in the future. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I think Ubuntu Studio is incredible. It's a great tool and a great resource. But I only have so much hardware, and I want to move on and get on with learning more about Linux. So I did install Linux Mint 18.1 on that old Dell laptop, and I'm going to use it for a while. We'll see how it goes, and I'll probably update you from time to time. But I think Linux Mint has been moving in the right direction for years now. I've never really seen a bad Linux Mint release, in my opinion. I came across Linux Mint back on Linux Mint 8. And if you remember those days, Linux Mint had the really green theme. And it was actually quite fun to use. It was, everything was all green, no way around it. And starting around Linux Mint 10 is when they went to the Mint X theme. And I think they've been hitting home runs ever since. With that said, what Linux Mint and trying Linux Mint has done for me over the last few days and last week or so really starts to make me consider a different setup for this podcast. And now that I don't have Ubuntu Studio installed, I'm deciding whether or not I want to move away from this old 10-year-old Dell for editing this podcast to another machine that I have. The reason being is when I edit, it's a little slow. I won't say it's terrible, but on much newer hardware, the editing would go quicker. So I'm going to move. I think I'm moving away from my old Dell laptop. It's sort of slowing down. It's still usable, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to move over to my System 76 that I bought used on eBay. I think it's probably released in 2012, so it's probably looking at a 5-year-old computer. And I'm deciding whether or not I want to stick with Antergos on that, or if I want to try something like Mint or even Ubuntu Studio on that System 76. I could do something like dual booting, but I really like to keep that machine as my primary Linux computer for doing anything Linux-wise on there and getting work done. So I'm curious. I may move away from Antergos, but for right now, I think I'm going to stick with that. We'll see. I haven't decided yet. I'm really curious about that. So, what do you guys think? Have you guys used Linux Mint 18? Are you a Linux Mint user yourself? Do you think Linux Mint is the best Linux desktop environment or Linux desktop itself? Do you think Cinnamon is the best desktop environment? I would say it's one of the best. I would say it's really close to a lot of other great distributions. I think there's a lot of great work being done on Linux Mint. Is it the best? I don't know. I think everybody has a different opinion. And I'm going to stick with it for a while and see where it goes. So if you'd like to give me some feedback and tell me what you think about Linux Mint, I would be glad to hear it. And what do you use Linux Mint for? Send me an email, mrptechreviews@gmail.com. And that's going to do it for this week. So thank you, everybody, for listening. I really appreciate those who are tuning in week after week. Again, if you want to help me out with getting an HDMI Capture card, go over to mrptechreviews.com, hit that donate button, and help me move forward with all of the great content that I look forward to doing in the future. That's going to do it for this week. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening, and take care for the following week.